Thanks, Dan. Okay, I want to welcome everyone to our April 2022 monthly meeting. I'll run over a few things here before we have our guest speaker.
Another version of it just doesn't have the ice maker. You have to add.
Remember that scenario?
Please turn off your microphone unless you're going to talk, because it comes in on the background. So let's start up with next month is our annual birdathon, and I encourage everyone to go on. I think, is it on our website that you can pull down the list, or is it in Heron Herald? Anyone know? Anyway, you can. I think it's on the Heron Herald. You can go on and get a list for people to sign up and spend a day counting birds and get money for Rainier Audubon. It is one of our bigger money makers throughout the year, and pick a day and go out there, rain or shine. Also, we have board elections coming up, and that's going to be in May. And Dan, you want to say something about that? Looks like Dan is.
Well, the only thing is that anybody that wants to run needs to get their bios into me by the end of the week.
Okay, I'll try and remember that. We're always looking, as you can see here, the third one down, we're always looking for board members, especially someone to take over the treasurer position. Candidates will be posted in the May Heron Herald, and election will be held by mail-in ballot in June. We're also looking for volunteers for coming up in June. We'll be having, I'll schedule a meeting here in the next couple of weeks for sure, and we'll nail down who's going to be doing what, and we'll firm up the schedule. And tomorrow, we're having a webinar on gardening for birds. And basically, this is going to be tomorrow night at 7 p.m. You can go on our website and scroll down on the monthly calendar and click on the day for tomorrow, and it will bring up the webinar link to see the webinar. And that starts at 7 p.m. tonight, and I think it goes to what, 8:30, something like that. So there'll be 3 master gardeners involved doing this. So it'll be interesting to see what native plants work the best for attracting more birds to your yard. Anyone got any other comments?
Yeah, I think the gardening for birds is going to be really a lot of fun with the 3 gardeners that we do have coming in. One is, we're really lucky that we have so many great gardeners in our Audubon group that are willing to share things. And so we have Marie West Johnson, who's going to be talking about a lot of the birds that are native plants that she has in her backyard. And she's got some great shots of the different birds, so it'll give you some ideas of things you can do in your yard. And then Alex Jukums is, he's kind of focusing on how to create plants and habitat that can provide habitat for caterpillars and insects and stuff year round. And then Dan is doing a fun project in his yard on getting rid of some invasives and kind of doing a restoration with a lot of native plants. So I think you'll get some good ideas, and I'm sure anybody has questions, bring them in. And then the following week, we have another webinar that is for helping you with bird identification. It's how to use an app on your phone called Merlin, which is from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And it's a wonderful app because you can basically, they walk you through some questions. What's the size of the bird? What are the main colors, blah, 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 and voila, it gives you some suggestions of the bird that you've seen, or if you have a photo or a sound recording of the bird, it can help you to identify where you are. So come join us for that one too.
And that app is forever getting better. I guess it's up to like 80% of the birds you see now you can identify through this app without any question. So,
Yeah, high accuracy.
yeah, high accuracy. So it's well worth looking into. Any other questions or statements or? Well, without further ado, we're going to open up the meeting to Linda. Hey, is it Hagen or Hagen?
Hagen.
I'm used to Haagen-Dazs. Okay, and she's going to give a talk on the songbirds of the sagebrush. And I suppose it's mostly about Eastern Washington shrub-steppe habitat, which there isn't much left. What is it, about 20% original steppe left?
Correct.
Yeah, and if you know where to go, it's a dynamite place to look for birds. So without further ado, Lindell, you're up.
Okay, I'm just going to share this screen in a second, but before we do that, there's one more thing I just want to say about Lindell that is really awesome, and just recognize her, is that Lindell has been, I had to put this photo in Lindell. She's been with this Spokane Audubon for about 50 years and has spent thousands of hours volunteering, providing lifelong bird education to her community. And, her latest work is what we're going to see tonight, and helping organize the surveys. And so for all of this great work that she's done, she won the Washington Audubon's Helen Engel Award.
No,
And
I launched it again.
can you
You're not
put your
sitting
mute
here
on?
and it happens, I guess I just
Okay, just
sit
one.
there.
Please mute your microphones, people.
Anyway, so I just wanted to recognize her for this huge accomplishment she did, and thank her for her conservation. So without more, we'll let you share, Lindell. There you go. So now if you just go to your green thing for the share screen, and you should be.
Okay.
Excellent.
Okay. You're speaking of being with Spokane Audubon for 50 years, and your note about treasure. I've been treasure for 30 years, and I've decided that this year is my last. So we are also looking for a treasurer. So it seems to be a common thread among chapters. And my program, rather than Songbirds of Eastern Washington Shrub-Steppe, I called it Songs of Eastern Washington Shrub-Steppe, because the shrub-steppe truly sings to me. It is a remarkable place. It is beautiful in its rugged way and has lots of fascinating features. Now, you need to try to imagine with me that you're here. This is a shrub-steppe habitat just north of Odessa. And it's about 5 o'clock, 5:30 in the morning. You're getting ready to do your survey, and the sun has finally poked through the clouds, and it's maybe 50 degrees and a light breeze. And the first thing you hear is the meadowlark singing to you. And before too long, you have the sage thrasher joining in the chorus. Another boisterous bird who has a varied song that just keeps bubbling along. And one birder thought it sounded rather like a jazz musician with its bebopping around. And then the scent of the sage as you walk through it is something that I've grown to love. And I've had to tone down the calls of these two birds. And I at times wished when we were doing our surveys, we could tone them down a bit, as it creates quite a ruckus for us. Now, the shrub-steppe habitat has 3 sagebrush species, and they are what is known as a keystone species. Without the sagebrush, you don't have the habitat. It is an integral part of the shrub-steppe. In addition to the 3 species of sagebrush, which are required or essential for the sage grouse and the other species that we'll be looking at. There are also 2 kinds of rabbit brush. Mule deer, especially in the winter, will munch on those, and they attract a lot of butterflies and insects. Bitter brush is another type of shrub. And then we have forbs. Forbs are plants with non-woody stems, bunch grasses, and the biocrust. And I'll talk more about the other things later, but I'd like to mention the biocrust and how important that is to the shrub-steppe habitat. It's created from mosses and lichens and other little bits and pieces that help create a crust across the top of the ground. This insulates the ground from losing its moisture, and it also helps hold the soil down when the winds pick up. And it's some deterrent to the cheatgrass that can be so destructive when it gets a foothold in the shrub steppe. So we need to make sure that when we're out in the shrub steppe, we try to minimize our impact and stay on a established trail, not going off. And it is easily disrupted by cattle and the motorized vehicles we want to avoid. So this is Artemisia tridentata. It's the large sagebrush. It's a deep soil shrub steppe plant, and it is essential to the sage grouse. The bush provides habitat and nesting areas for a number of species, and you can see the 3 lobed leaves indicated by the tridentata in the lower portion. Artemisia rigata is the rigid sagebrush, and its leaves are almost needle-like in that they're quite thin and narrow. The large sagebrush, Artemisia tridentata, can be anywhere from 1.5 to 9 feet tall, so can get quite large. The Artemisia rigata and the Artemisia arbuscula also, they stay within 18 inches or lower. The arbuscula has a 3-lobed leaf as well. As someone mentioned earlier, the shrub steppe habitat is only 20% of what it used to be. And a large portion of that loss was due to agriculture. There's additional losses from infrastructure and housing that has been established in the area. The gray rabbit brush can be used by mule deer, as I mentioned before, in the wintertime. And from the scientific name, Ericameria nauseosa, I assume that I wouldn't recommend eating it. The green rabbit brush, another variation, maybe a little smaller. And bitter brush, which has a white flower on it, while all the others have yellow flowers. Some of the forbs that you can find are the bitter or arrowleaf balsam root, and then there's several varieties of balsam root out there. And then the bitter root, obviously you're not in deep soil shrub steppe when you see the bitter root, because it manages to survive in very shallow, rocky soil. And yellow fritillaries, among others. And in the bottom right, I think that's probably a kind of wild onion. And I don't know how many of you know that we have a native cactus in Washington. And it's scattered throughout the shrub steppe, but I know I have found it at Beasley Hills, which is a nature conservancy land owning, and it is just north of Quincy, Washington, and has a wonderful variety of the forbs and other samples of the shrub steppe habitat. Now, the greater sage grouse is what is called an umbrella species. An umbrella species is the species that if you provide and have those present in your habitat, you have provided everything that any other species in the habitat would need. So the umbrella species being the greater sage grouse, these birds use 95 to 100% of their winter food is the sagebrush plant. And overall, it's 60 to 80% with insects providing the other portion, maybe a few seeds here and there. There are only 8% of the sage grouse that originally populated Eastern Washington or the Central Basin. And part of that is because, you know, we've got 20% of the habitat, but only 8% of the grouse. And the habitat has been so fragmented that it doesn't meet their needs. Also, with the agriculture, we have provided a lot of food for rodents. So you've got the rodents coming in to eat all the grain that is left on the ground. Then you've got coyotes coming in to eat the rodents. And you've also got great horned owls that are much more populous in the windbreaks that people put around their homes, providing them with habitat. And then we've got all the utility poles that provide roosts for hawks and ravens and such. And all of those things take a much greater toll on the grouse than might have otherwise been the case. When things prior to development, there would not have been this concentration of so many predators where we find the grouse. Now, these birds are on a lek. If you're not familiar with what a lek is, it's an area where the males come to display. And the sound you're hearing now are the air sacs that are in that white ruff that you see around its neck. And they inflate these sacs and then they compress again to make the sounds. And that white just sort of bobs up and down as they're going about, and they're strutting their stuff. And they start at dawn, if not before, and it continues until 7:30 or 8. So they're doing this for hours on end. And while they're doing that, the females have circled around them to see who's putting on the best dance and has the endurance and so forth to choose their mate. And excuse me, this is the sharp-tailed grouse. It's a much smaller bird. The greater sage grouse weighs up to 6 pounds, the males do. Females about 3, and the sharp-tailed grouse weighs about 1.5 pounds. And they can stomp their feet 20 times a second. Also will shake tail feathers. And you can see here, this one, the tail feathers are pretty there's a tip on this one feather out here at the end. And then the pink sack that they've got, they inflate that. And so they've got a whole variety of ways to create their sounds. They're a much quieter bird, and so might not be quite as susceptible to the predators as the greater sage grouse. In Lincoln County, the sage grouse have, especially with the fires that have gone on, have basically been extirpated. The Fish and Wildlife Department worked for a decade or more to reintroduce them to their historic lek site, and we're making some progress. And the same with the sharp-tailed grouse. They had been enhancing the habitat for them as well. And with the fires that went through, more than 700,000 acres were burned in 2020 when the fall fires came through, and basically burned up all the leks in Lincoln County, Douglas County, and those areas further north. So it was absolutely devastating to work so hard to enhance the habitat for these birds, and then to have it burned up in a matter of hours. And it'll take years to replace that. So about 8-9 years ago, we had a lot of research indicating how much the numbers of sage grouse and the numbers of sharp-tailed grouse, but did not really have a good handle on the presence of other species that are found in the shrub steppe. And so we had a data gap, and wanted to find out which areas were most productive for the other birds that inhabit the area. Spokane, or Audubon, Washington, with Christy Norman leading the program, helped to create with Matt Vanderhagen from WDFW surveys that we could use to establish the presence of several species of birds, and then use that information to help create a database that we can use to support decisions regarding land use planning. In addition to Audubon, Washington, and WDFW, the Bureau of Land Management was also very supportive of us, and we did a lot of our surveys on their land as well as WDFW land. There's 3 species that we were focused on were the sagebrush sparrow, the sage thrasher, which you've already heard, and the brewer sparrow. And all of these birds require sagebrush and shrub steppe habitat in order to survive. So after determining what species to look at, they created this random grid, and each of those little blue squares you see were numbered, and the red dots were areas that were not accessible for our surveys or didn't have shrub steppe habitat, and the yellow dots were those that were completed, and the green dots were about to be worked on when this map was photographed. And then each one of those squares, when you zoomed in on your GIS program, looked something like this. And you had different numbers were assigned to different chapters. And so we'd select a certain number of sites to do each year. Then we had to look at the site. Our surveys, except for the last year, we did do some private lands that were used for access for hunting. They also the landowners allowed us to access it for our surveys. But we had to establish parking spots and then a survey site, and this required at least a couple trips to the area. The mustard colored there was BLM land, and I think the blue color was Fish and Wildlife. But as you can see, some of the public land is not really accessible because there are no roads, and if there are roads, then you've got private land in between the public land. So it was a little complicated at times trying to arrange everything so it worked out. And one of the things we found is that just because the map says there's a road doesn't mean that there really is one. And we had several sites like this and other places where there was nothing even this distinct. Here we are placing our markers at the sites. Sometimes we did it in the spring just before our surveys, and then other times we tried doing it in fall. And then habitats changed while you were gone, and sometimes you'd have to wade through a lake to get to the site that wasn't there before. So it was always interesting to see what you would find when you went out. Volunteers needed to be able to identify songs of the key species, so hearing was essential. The first year there were several people there who didn't recognize this, and their observations were a little suspect. Also need to know the field marks. Most of the time though, you don't see them very clearly, or they're hiding in the bushes, so being able to identify their songs was essential. You also needed to know how to use a GPS and make sure you bring your GPS with you when you did the surveys. A lot of reporting on eBirds, and there were 3 submissions for each site each time you went out. You had a traveling survey as you went in, then you waited 5 or 10 minutes, and then you had the stationary survey at the site and did that for 10 minutes, and then you recorded the birds you saw on the way out again. You needed to also make a comment as to whether sagebrush was present or not. In Lincoln County and the eastern portion of the shrub steppe, it would not be uncommon to have no sagebrush present. And making sure you followed the protocol. So our first bird, which unfortunately, the only time we heard this was when we were doing the training in Moses Coulee. on some Nature Conservancy land. And it was land that had 20 or 25 years ago been farmland that had been taken over from Shrub-Steppe. Nature Conservancy got the land, replanted the sagebrush, and by the time we visited it 20 years after it had been growing, it was shoulder high at least, most of the Shrub-Steppe, and you had sagebrush sparrows. And so it was really very encouraging to see that you could actually reestablish sagebrush and the Shrub-Steppe habitat and attract one of the key species that needed 10 to 15 acres of the habitat intact rather than being fragmented. So that now it's all been burned again. So very disappointing in that regard. And he's got a lovely gray head and eye ring, and he's got a dark spot in the center of a plain breast. The brewer sparrow is sort of described as the sparrow without any distinct field marks. Fairly pale, but its song is quite distinctive. Somebody described it sort of as one of those sprinklers that sprays back and forth. And there are some places where there are just multiple numbers of sparrows singing at the same time. One that we discovered was north of Odessa, which is a prime area that did not burn this couple years ago. So looking forward to going out there again. Again, the sage thrasher is one of our key species, and I played his song for you already. The Savannah sparrow is another sparrow commonly found, and while not one of the key species that we were looking at, we need to be able to identify its song so we could determine whether it was present or not and eliminate the other species that it might be. It does have yellow by the eye, but you can't always see that. It's not always present. And again, a lot of these birds are feeding on the ground, eating seeds and insects, and don't spend a lot of time up above in the tops of bushes. And there's Savannah sparrow's song. And some people occasionally will confuse it with grasshopper sparrow. And here's the grasshopper sparrow. And one distinctive field mark for it, the silhouette, you can see it's got a very plain and flat head here. And there's no bump at where the bill meets the head. So it's a pretty distinctive silhouette. And he opens his mouth so wide, and you would think he'd produce some magnificent loud sound, but all you hear is this, and it's harder for me to hear this at all. It's says tick disease, and I can hear the tick, but not so much the disease. And I'm moving the volume up, but I don't know if it's going to help too much. It is a very quiet little song. And then we have the Vesper sparrow, one of the common ones. The rufous on the shoulder is a characteristic of the Vesper sparrow, but again, you don't always see the rufous depending on how recently the bird molted. And so these were some of our birds that we would find. That's its song. Reminds you a little bit of the song sparrow, starting out with those two clear notes. Another wonderful shrub steppe bird is the horned lark. Very distinctive silhouette. And Curtis Mann, he's one of our young photographers. He captured this photo on the top right. And if you didn't, have never seen a young horned lark, this is what you see on the bottom left. And spending so much time out in the shrub steppe, got to see this several times. And the cobblestone that this young bird is scrambling over is old railroad bed. And this was our trail to one of our sites for surveying, and a mile on that made it seem longer. And of course, the meadowlark, always singing, head up in the air, and such a wonderful sign of spring. There were times, however, though, when it was a matter of trying to turn their volume down so that we could hear the other birds that were in the area as well. So after we got all of our eBird data posted and the sites were assessed, the preliminary data showed the presence and absence of birds throughout the shrub steppe habitat that we have remaining. And you can see that the greatest number of observations was in the Yakima Tri-Cities area, with another strong showing up in the Moses Coulee area. Perks of participating. We got to spend time in a marvelous habitat and learned so much about it and appreciated it. And even though there were not a lot of observations of the key species in the eastern portion of the shrub steppe, it seems just as valuable to me as any of those other areas. And we got to spend a lot of time visiting with like-minded people, because we were traveling an hour and a half, probably on average, if not longer, to get to the site and then back. So you got to know people really well over this period of time. And I found that we ended up expanding our membership because it was a different way of participating. Some people like the meetings and some people like bird trips, but having a survey like this really attracted a different group of folks, and it was well worth our effort to do that. And you got to see places that you might not have seen otherwise. And the serenades from birds were well worth it in a sense. Now, these are two folks, and since we did not have any of the target species in Spokane when we were doing our training, we had to improvise, and we played the songs and then had these stick versions of the representing the birds. And the weather wasn't always what you'd like it to be. These were April observations, and can be foggy and cold, but you go out and you collect your data, and then you get rewarded in June when the wildflowers are blooming and making for an outstanding experience. This shot was by Twin Lakes, and theoretically we're supposed to keep our distance between parking and the site to less than 300 meters. Well, we had to go probably 1.5 miles to get to our site, because that was the only access we could get. And we ended up going through multiple habitats, getting to the Shrub-Steppe you see up above. And they had a species list of probably 30 different ones. And most of the traveling surveys had 5 to 10 at most. But so we were well rewarded for our long walk in. And this area, we saw a family of badgers while we were looking for our traveling to our site. And another unusual happening was as we returned after our survey, we were walking along near some fairly large sagebrush. There was a cluster of 2 or 3. We saw 4 or 5 red-tailed hawks flying out from this cluster of shrubs. And it was going to be a hot sunny day, and I think they were using sagebrush as a shade for themselves. So you saw all kinds of things and behaviors that you had not seen before. And we had a whole range of ages participating. This is Will, and I think when he started doing surveys, he was 8 or 9 years old, and soon developed the respect of everybody that went out with him, because being young, he had really good hearing, and he knew his songs. And here you actually see him using binoculars, but his favorite way of birding was using his little camera with a telephoto lens that would zoom out. And I've found that several of the younger bird watchers find this as their preferred method of bird watching rather than using binoculars. And this is just a portion of the groups. You can see all the names of the participants that helped over the 6 or more years that we did this. Curtis, the young man on the left, has become quite a birder and is, I think, on to bigger and better things. So had lots of fun, got to meet new people, and food played a part. You know, food is always a good thing to share with one another. And in the top right, you see Christy Norman, who, as well as organizing it, frequently participated in surveys when she could. And that's my son, who was in town for a short visit. So he went on a LEC survey and then a Songbirds survey, and they were quite excited, at least he was, when they finally were able to cut this sandwich in half, because he was really hungry and Christy was generous enough to share it with them. Some other interesting sightings that we had were the loggerhead shrike, which does not need sagebrush, but we saw it fairly regularly out when we were doing our surveys. And one unusual species that we found, we were up in this Shrub-Steppe habitat with just shrubs, And I see this bird and it looks sort of dark to begin with. And I thought perhaps it was a crow or something, raven. And then it got closer and I realized it was a Lewis's woodpecker. And you can see it sitting on top of this bush here, and you can almost see the rosy color sides in the dark back. But just always something wonderful going on. And then this was a reward for going out and doing the worst sight ever. This site had no shrubs. It had cattle on it. It was about a mile away from I-90, so you could hear traffic noise going by. And our stake had been knocked down or taken away, but you'd go out there and you'd maybe hear 2 or 3 birds if you used your imagination over all the traffic noise. But we were leaving the site and it was near the Sprague sewage treatment ponds. So that was the reward for everybody, to go to the treatment ponds when you were done with the survey. But we had an extra bonus as we were driving out from the site. We saw some bird fly off and realized it was a short-eared owl. And I was disappointed that I hadn't been able to get a picture. But then it landed adjacent to the Jeep track that we were driving on. And so I had the passenger open the window and we drove up slowly. And he sat there and sat there. And I did not crop this picture at all and couldn't quite get his tail in. But I sat in the driver's seat and took a picture through the passenger window. And I decided he must have been a young one, really dumb, young and dumb. But so many rewards from getting out and seeing nature. Mule deer, they're always fun to watch, seeing them spring along over the landscape. And this jackrabbit, he had showed up just before we got to one of our survey sites and quickly disappeared. And so we stood there for 5 or 10 minutes quietly waiting to do our survey. You want to wait so that the birds have time to settle down and reactivate their activities. Well, apparently we were really quiet because the jackrabbit came out of the bush and hopped once or twice, and I got a nice picture, and then he was gone. But apparently it really pays to keep quiet for 5 or 10 minutes. So what do we do with all this information that we gathered? The Audubon Washington helped organize the chapters that had created the data, and we created the Shrub-Steppe Conservation Committee. And one of the major things that we have been working on is developing a clean energy screening tool, a GIS program that puts together all the data from our surveys, all the eBird entries that we made, all of the data that's been collected about sharp-tailed grouse and their observations and presence, and the sage grouse as well. And then prioritizing the areas. And right now there are about 24 different possible clean energy projects. And we need to be concerned about climate change and reducing our carbon footprint. But we also need to recognize that whatever you use to create energy takes a toll on our environment. And if we try to replace all of the oil with solar and wind, frequently it's the quote desert, the place where there is nothing that is recommended for a siting for these things. And hopefully with the clean energy screening tool that we've created, we'll have some firm reasons for not citing these projects in certain areas. So working at not only green energy, but reducing energy use, I think is something that we have to really stress. And I think I just read recently where the state of Washington has created the one of the most strict housing criteria for energy conservation of any of the states. We need to fund WDFW so that they can, we've worked with them in a variety of projects of reseeding and replanting some of the areas that have been burnt. The legislature has given a directive to WDFW to have some preemptive ways of providing the vegetation and the plants that are needed to re-establish habitats after these drastic events. Unfortunately, there were so many fires in 2020 that all of the providers were basically, their sources were all sold out. And so we need to have some way of trying to anticipate or have another way of providing the plants that are needed for this kind of devastation. And recognizing land use management, maybe not having so many utility wires strung out all over every place, which seems to be one of the major sources for fires in these fragile habitats, along with lightning strikes and man-made fires that are not taken care of properly. So, and then, you know, don't put houses where they don't need to be. So enjoy your public lands, all of them. And are there any questions?
I have a question. This is Cindy. If we were going to go out that way, are there any places that you could recommend for us that you know we could access, that you could see?
One of my favorite areas is around Odessa, and there's a fair amount of Bureau of Land Management property there, just north and west of the town of Odessa. There's also some fish and wildlife land there. I've heard more brewer sparrows there than any other place, I think. And I'm hoping to go out there Wednesday. Things between the weather and all the other commitments and stuff, I haven't been able to get out in the Shrub-Steppe yet this year. And so Wednesday, this is going to be my day for going out. And we're going to go to Odessa and look around at those areas. And then I mentioned the Beasley Hills natural area, which is north of Quincy, but I'm not sure if that got burned or not. And I know the Moses Cooley area, the Nature Conservancy land where we did our training, unfortunately, all of that got burned. Douglas County got devastated. And if you notice the map, a lot of there's some really good observations in the Yakima and Tri-Cities area, but I'm not as familiar with and I think you probably could go online and find, you could go to eBird and find out sites for, look for different species and see where they are. So that would be my recommendation.
Great input. Thank you.
Mhm.
Any other questions? Well, Lindell, we'd like to thank you for joining our meeting and giving us lots of information about the Shrub-Steppe. I know one of my favorite places to go is up on Tannum Creek on the Yakima River Valley. This time of year, you see, it's a pretty good habitat for seeing a lot of stuff that you were talking about.
Mhm. Well, yeah, it's just, I have
Go ahead.
fallen in love with it. And there's just the shrubs and the plants, and it's just a remarkable place with a great variety and a beauty all its own.
Any other comments or questions?
I don't know about you, but I could just smell the sage as you were talking about it in the beginning and everything. So thank you for that beautiful opening to just get us planted right in there. It was fabulous.
Thank
Just
you.
loved your presentation.
Mhm.
And just a reminder, tomorrow night, you can learn about native plants to plant in your backyard. And Marie and Dan, and who's the third person?
Alex
That
Juka.
would be
Alex.
me, Jay. But Lindell, thank you so much for this presentation, because we launch a lot of our high power rockets over on the east side, and wading through 9-foot high sage to find a rocket is very difficult. But now you've made me appreciate that I need to stand there and that maybe I can hear the birds as I look for my
Yes,
rocket. So
yes,
thank you.
absolutely.
Well, without further ado,